Well, it's Benno again. So just moving on from some of the safe seafood stuff or seafood handling, we're just going to move on to a tad now across to introduce the topic of safe working practices. Now, it doesn't really matter where we're working, whether we're on a trawler, whether we're on a research boat, whether we're working in a seafood processing facility, whether I'm transporting seafood products, whether I'm working on a fish farm. It doesn't really matter where we go. We've got regulations that dictate um, what safe working practice might look like. Now, generally speaking, we've got the overarching Occupational Health and Safety Act of the Commonwealth, and from that each state will interpret their own version of that. Hence speaking, something in Queensland might be slightly different or slightly different wording within inside each state department's act. It doesn't mean that everybody is operating differently. It just means that there's different interpretations of how we might apply the Commonwealth law, I guess is the best way to say it. So, moving on, you can quite honestly see that guy there really shouldn't be an electrician by the looks of it. Looks like he should be playing Kaplunk or one of those games that you stack blocks up, Jenga. Anyway, moving on. Who's responsible for your safety in Australia? It is it's not the Act that's responsible. It's the Act that has the responsibility for dictating the laws within WA, and the regulations interpret the Act. And the most relevant one for us right now is the 1996 version of the regulations. All right, and inside the Act itself, Section 20 and 28 detail the requirements of employees, and the employers are in Section 20 there somewhere, I think, as well. And ultimately, the Act and the regulation empowers any employer or employer to be responsible. So it doesn't just mean that the manager is responsible, or the OSH rep, or so on and so forth. It's also the employee or anybody on site potentially to point out that there may be a hazard or a risk associated with a piece of equipment. Ultimately, everybody is responsible for everybody else. Alright, now coming back to the triple bottom line, alright, which we discussed quite relevant just about in every single block of units that we should have done by this point in time. We think about the economic, the environmental and social impacts of many of our reporting systems. And if you look at them, we should be able to find that there is some of these points that fit within the OH&S idea. Alright, so from an economic perspective, reducing challenging environments, I guess you might say, or risks within the environments may empower us to make more money for less downtime through injuries or less payouts because of people getting hurt. The environment may be more benefited by it, so we might find that there's a risk associated with, say, something like an oil spill, for instance, that we hadn't looked at, and we look at it within our OH&S program to protect our employees, and what do you know, we protect the environment at the same time. And then obviously there's a social impact behind it, so we don't want people, out of work for too long, because then it damages family fabrics and so on and so forth, and we end up with unhappy workers and unhappy families. So think of reducing risk, and reducing risk in an operation can lead to an adherence to other core businesses. So, other cores within that business. So, like, if we change something in our work practice, it may impact on positively or negatively within some other component of our operation. Alright, so how do we assess risk? It could be just as simple as looking, there's a chair that's fallen over, or there's a pipe there that shouldn't be there, pick it up, put it away. Something simple, something that no one needs training for, something that anybody with half a brain should be able to do. But there is other mechanisms for addressing hazards and risks. Some of them should be done with a team-based approach. Some may be as simple as what we down the bottom there. We've got a hazard reporting, a JHA or a JSA, which are job hazard analysis and job safety analysis. A lot of those are done on mine sites, and the army use them and so on and so forth. Or alternatively, we've got that thing on there on the left-hand side, which is a hazard, the Australian standard for hazard and risk assessment, right, which gives us a category of unacceptable, high, medium or low Sometimes we call them 1A, 1B, so on and so forth to get the concept of that. Alright, so I'm going to talk a little bit about that later in a direct risk assessment module or a tutorial, but we realistically need to be able to perceive what a hazard might be, and a hazard is just something that may cause injury. Practically, the risk is the chance of that injury or that hazard causing that injury. So, i.e., a slippery floor is the hazard. The risk might be quite serious if someone falls over and cracks their head and has a hemorrhage on the brain, for instance. It actually might be catastrophic if that goes on for too long. So generally when we're performing a risk assessment, we assess the risk with no control in place, i.e. slippery floor, Ben walks into the room, slippery floor, bare feet. Alright? What is the chance of me slipping over and cracking my head and dying from that? Potentially it's quite high because I haven't got anything to protect me. Alright, so then what we would do is we would run out that risk assessment, and like I said, I will talk about that later on. But we would run out that risk assessment to try and achieve our end game, and that might be, if we look down here on the left hand side, it might be a catastrophic outcome in death, and it might be quite probable. So we would be sitting around a 1B category, which would probably be about as worst as we would want to have if I always wore bare feet. Alright, so from there we can then put a control in place, and we really need to be looking at trying to achieve a level of control that eliminates the risk altogether, but sometimes that's not achievable. So we bring in the concept of the hierarchy of control. Alright, so once again, this should realistically have participation from as many employees as possible, or a core group that is a good representation of the business. Looking to document the hazards and the risks and acting on each through, I guess, what we would call a triage approach. So to the most urgent situation to the least urgent situation based on their level of risk. And the hierarchy of control model helps us to look at the methods of control. Alright, so basically what the hierarchy seeks to achieve is to achieve an efficient way to manage the risk, and the most efficient way to manage the risk is to eliminate it completely. Alright, so in the situation of a slippery floor, a way of eliminating that risk is to grab a mop and a bucket or a squeegee or whatever it is and eliminate the water from on the floor altogether. Okay? So, we then come down the model to substitution, engineering, administrative. Behaviour is sometimes eliminated from it because behaviour and administration kind of go together. And then we get right to the bottom, and PPE sits right at the bottom. So our personal protective equipment is actually probably the least protective way of managing a risk. So i.e. I put some boots on and I can still slip over walking through that water. So you can see the green arrow, the further up that pyramid we work, the greater efficiency we get and the greater our sustainable outcomes become. And the further down we get towards the pointy end, it means that people have to be more aware of the hazards and the risks, and they have to comply more. So, i.e., let's just eliminate the risk so that practically no one has to even think about it. So we will also walk through a quick tutorial on the hierarchy of control a little bit later in time. Right, so in our work safety environment, we have to abide by the Equal Opportunity Act, alright, because there might be religious or political convictions that may get in the way. There might be racial stuff for some reason. There might be, the other one's gender discrimination in there. So I can't just say, well, we can't do that because you're a female. It's a male's work environment. That's just not going to happen. It's against the law. So Section 169 of the Equal Opportunity Act describes the penalties for breaching the Act and subsequent regulations. Alright, so it dictates, or it tells us what the penalties look like, and it could be $500,000 for some businesses, maybe more. The regulation, in effect, addresses the social aspect of the triple bottom line. So, once again, we're back to, hey, what's people, profit, protection. Okay, so we're looking at the people part within that social aspect. Risk management should be an unbiased approach. So any way that we're looking at risks related to discrimination or not, it should be an unbiased approach. So we shouldn't be sitting in my shoes going, well, I'm a man, this is the way I think it should be done. You should be able to look outside of the box and go, well, what are the real risks and the hazards associated to a compliant workplace? Not very easy. When we're thinking about it, we also need to be thinking about the ethical decisions that we make within inside our safety in the workplace. Alright, so we need to act with care and diligence and make decisions that are honest, fair, impartial and timely, and consider the relevant information. Don't make assumptions. You should be looking at what's been tabled or what's been documented and make a decision on that. Relationships with others are very important. Alright, we need to treat people with respect, courtesy and sensitivity and recognise that their interests, rights and safety and welfare are at hand. And if they perceive that there's a risk, we need to be looking at it and saying, well, I don't think there is. We should be saying, well, how do you think we should be managing it? Do you want to sit down and have a meeting about it? How do you think Bob thinks about that as well? And we need to be accountable in a situation. We can't just write it off and say, well, you told us that we wanted to do that. We did it your way and now it's your fault. All right, so we need to use the resources of the state in a responsible and accountable manner that ensures the efficiency and effectiveness of the appropriate use of human, natural and financial resources. Goes on and on and on. Even if we aren't working in a state-based department, we still need to be considering this stuff because it is the law. Obviously there's privacy required in consultation, so where privacy regulation or privacy principles might be significant is when we're consulting with stakeholders or members of the public. We don't want to say Joe Blow walked in and told me this in a document, and now I'm going to make it public information. He might not want it to go that way, so we've got to consider the privacy of other people. We might be dealing with other personal information. It could be related to, say for instance, safety in the workplace. Might be such and such had an interaction when he was doing some compliance work at a boat ramp and it ended up in a situation where both people have got assault charges against each other. We don't really want to be releasing that information back to the public as to who it was, how and when it happened. We might be dealing with intellectual property, all right, when we're talking about safety-related information or otherwise. So one of the reasons why we want to adhere to this privacy regulation is obviously because it is the law. There's penalties that are associated with it. We also want to promote an active and engaging stakeholder relationship, for instance. We don't want to be telling Joe Blow that Jack Black did this and now you're doing that and now they know that you've spoken about them behind their back. We've got to develop relationships, and privacy regulation can help us achieve that. It helps us to avoid disruption in the consultation process and to maintain workplace relationships even in our immediate work environment. So we realistically, doesn't really matter where we go, we should have policies that embrace and associate the legislation and the regulation, and hopefully they're to a situation where when we're working in a workplace, regardless of whether it's an environment outside of an office, on a boat, in a hatchery, in a processing facility, in a truck, the policies should be easy to understand and read. They shouldn't be of a situation where I can't understand that, I'm just going to sign a document and say I do understand it. Because if it's hard to read, chances are the acceptance rate for it when it does get released, if it is a policy that's being reviewed, is going to be low, or the compliance associated with it may be low. So you might end in a situation where everybody's got this policy, it's hard to police, and then even though it is being policed, no one adheres to it because they don't understand what's going on. So any of these policies related to workplaces need to be adaptable and understandable and easy to read and so on and so forth. So basically these policies lay out the rules for a procedure or the rules of the workplace and puts rules and laws into action within the workplace framework. Okay, so when we're developing a workplace policy, might not even just be a workplace policy, sometimes these things stem on to other processes such as best practice within an industry as well. So stage one, realistically, needs analysis. So we need to identify gaps by a change of internal or external factors or as a result of a regular review of the policy or procedure. So we might look and say, hey, something's changed outside of our business, actually inside our business now. This has changed, now we need to change our policy or procedure. For new policies and proposals, policies owners, for instance, we term the policy owner as the person who's developing the policy or the business that owns the policy, should liaise with policy sponsors or the government or whoever else to unite and gain an interim approval before commencing and drafting to a consultation phase. Right, so the consultation phase is to say, hey, this is what we believe is suitable. Consultation phase may then may be offered in a government department, it might be a local member or it might be Chamber of Commerce, who knows, and then they might be able to say, well, we think this is going to happen, and we go back to the drawing board and review it. So before we end up actioning the policy, it needs to be reviewed anyway. The consultation and drafting phase may undertake more research to ensure best practice. It might be a desktop audit, it might be visits to industry to find out what's going on, and consultation within stakeholders to gain in principle an agreement on the policy. Drafting of the policy would then occur and procedures would come out of that in appropriate templates for review and draft with the stakeholders, and stakeholders might be internal, they might be external, and depending on where we're going to with these policies, they might end up in codes of conduct that operate as an industry whole, or they may end up be, policies and procedures that are implemented with inside the business. So consider the impact of a new policy or procedure on stakeholder systems and operations and development of implementation and communication plans. So people are aware of when this stuff is being released, when it was last reviewed, how it's been modified, and taking into account any review or any implementation strategies to think about what are the impacts on those stakeholders. So if I do this, what happens to the guy at the other end? Is he going to lose money? Is he going to get hurt? Or is she going to wind up in, court because she did something wrong? Alright, so the document and implementation actions on a request for approval form, we're basically looking at how is this going to be implemented and will you implement it realistically? So this is more based on government policy, procedures, so on and so forth, but the framework could largely be the same for any normal commercial business. Stage 3 would end up in authorisation, so submit for approval and request for approval template goes off to your managers or to the stakeholder group, or it might be a group council, whatever it might be. They might sign off on it, say yay, it's all good to go, and then stage 4 we undertake the implementation steps, publish it through policies and procedures, directories, or like I say, codes of conduct or best practice guides might even pop up. Stage 5 is the maintenance, so we need to go through the monitoring process, making sure that, hey, if we're monitoring how many injuries we have, are they lost time injuries, are they minor injuries, are they major injuries, are they death? How did they achieve that? Did he crash his car? Did he drive off the end of the road? Did someone get bound up in a cray pipe, lose an arm, so on and so forth? We need to be logging, as a business, our interactions that may achieve better and safer outcomes for our staff and our workplace. Stage 6, we're going to look at the maintenance stage. We're going to look at what the risk indicators that we had. Did old mate rip his arm off? Why did that happen? Should it have happened? Obviously not. How can we prevent it from happening again? We would review it, go back through the whole policy and procedure. Once again, we're back to the PDCA cycle where we plan, do, check, act. We keep doing, we keep doing, we keep doing. Oops, someone's had an accident. We check what happened in the accident, we review it, we act upon it, then we go back to the planning phase, replan, do, check, act. So it's a continuous loop that's always being improved upon. Doesn't matter what we do in the workplace relation to safety, it is a continual living document that we have to do. If we don't do it, eventually we'll end up in a situation where someone gets hurt or killed, and that's the last thing we want to think about when we're trying to make sure that we're doing our business properly, ethically and safely. Alright, so yet again we're going to say goodbye, and if you've got any issues about what we've spoken about, feel free to email or call. Alright, ciao.